Hello and welcome to the debate right here at Press TV. Appreciate you being with us. I'm Marcia Hashemi. More terror by ISIL continues to take place as the terrorist group has wreaked havoc in both Syria and Iraq. Now, as the group has members from all over the world and is extremely ruthless, the question comes about how did they get their funding, who continues to support them, and why are those who claim to be fighting the terrorist group in actuality some of its biggest supporters. Stay with us as we take a look at these questions and others on this debate.
Months after taking parts of Syria and Iraq and creating its so-called caliphate, ISIL is known as one of the richest terror groups in the world. ISIL represents a new form of terrorist organization where funding is central to its activities. Its primary sources of revenue are mainly derived from illicit proceeds from its occupation of territory. They include bank looting and extortion, control of oil fields and refineries, as well as kidnapping for ransom. ISIL also earns money from looting and smuggling antiquities and then taxing the looters. According to a November report by the UN, ISIL raises several $1 million a month from illegal taxation. The terrorist group also raises up to $123,000 a day from ransom payments and more than $1.5 million of revenue from crude oil sales a day. Earlier this year, the UN Security Council passed a resolution banning all trade of antiquities from Syria and putting sanctions on anyone buying oil from ISIL. This was the first international measure to stem the ISIL's revenues. However, many are saying that more is needed to be done to determine the most effective countermeasures to stop ISIL's funding. Experts say in terrorists' order for ISIL to make more money, it needs to occupy more territory. This highlights the need to prevent the Takfiri group from taking more areas through military operations. The Iraqi and Syrian government forces have been engaged in fierce clashes with ISIL over the past month. The battles are considered to be difficult, partly due to measures taken by a number of countries, including Turkey. Ankara has been under fire from outside and inside Turkey for its direct and indirect cooperation with ISIL. Among other things, the country has so far resisted calls to join the international campaign against the terrorist group. It is also criticized for not placing border restrictions to prevent the flow of arms and militants to and from Syria. Many observers maintain that alongside military operations and measures to stem the terrorists' source of income, a halt to direct and indirect support for them can play a major role in defeating the group, which poses a global threat.
I'd like to welcome my guest to the program out of London, filmmaker and political commentator, Mr. Sukant Chandan, and out of Washington, D.C., Congressional Defense Policy Advisor, Mr. Frederick Peterson. Thank you both for being with us. Well, let's start this off in Washington with Mr. Peterson. Let's look at the roles, perhaps, of different entities that have played with the formation and support of ISIL. Your take on Turkey and Turkey's involvement in the formation and or support of ISIL?
Well, I think there is a significant force within Turkey, and Turkey is divided. There are those that reach to the West and reach for a secular state, but increasingly there is forces not of moderation but of extremism within Turkey that are seeking to expand that vision of a pure future unmitigated by modernity and reaching beyond the border to create a regional, if not a world, influence. This has significantly led to support from within Turkey of those radical forces of the emergent ISIL. And we should remember also that this conflict, what we're seeing right now, is not something that is taking place over the last months or over the last years or even decades, but this goes way back to World War I and the new lines that were being drawn when Turkey sided with the Axis powers against the French and the British, and there was this conflict to redraw the lines, the political lines.
Okay.
And then now it has become religious lines in the Middle East.
All right, stay with me, Mr. Peterson. Stay with me, Mr. Peterson. Let me get Mr. Chandan. Let me get Mr. Chandan in on this.
Okay.
Mr. Chandan, Mr. Peterson, it seemed, though, sort of an oxymoron on the one hand saying that Turkey, some elements of Turkey wanting to go towards modernity and thus trying to expand their influence and also supporting these groups such as ISIL. Your take in general, basically, first of all, with this perspective.
Good evening, Sister, and to all the viewers and our colleague in the United States. I think what we just heard from our colleague is a very convoluted and garbled attempt at analyzing something that our guest can't really accurately analyze because of his political bias. No, it did not start with Turkey's alliance with the Axis powers in the First World War, because what we're faced when we're dealing with ISIS is basically an ideological movement that has its roots in the Saudi version or perversion of Islam. And Saudi Arabia only exists historically because the British teamed up with Ibn Wahhab and the Saud family and instituted that state through genocide and massacres, actually. And that state, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf monarchies, only continue to exist in the Second World War period, when their historical alliance with the British, who keep them afloat, was then joined and in some ways was surpassed by the new patrons of the Gulf monarchies, which is the United States of America. We fast forward to the Iraqi resistance post the war of aggression and invasion of Iraq by primarily the United States and the UK regimes. And then we had Al-Qaeda 2.0 in the form of the Zarqawi-led franchise of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And what Zarqawi's leadership and evolution, however, depraved evolution it was, which it was, what it did, it sought to achieve for the British and the Americans and their regional allies the dividing, the tragic and traumatic dividing of the Iraqi resistance, which until then had some semblance of unity, particularly between the Sunni and Shia resistance forces. And what we've seen since then is that the Arab monarchies, as well as the usurping Zionist state of so-called Israel, and also the Turkish state, a leading NATO power, but along with its primary patrons in London, Paris, and Washington, has used ISIS and other death squad formations as well, such as Nusra and many others, to maintain not only the status quo in the interest of their hegemony, but importantly to deliver all their strategic interests and aims. No strategic interest of the West has been negatively impacted by ISIS.
Well, what about that, Mr. Peterson, if we look at what Mr. Sukant Chandan has said and talking about the role of Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf states, do you think that we would see ISIS or ISIL being able to sustain itself if it was not for the support of Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf, some of the Persian Gulf Arab states?
Actually, if your guest had listened to my remarks rather than responding kind of reflexively to them, he would have found that I was agreeing substantially with his position, that there is an ongoing machination and manipulation by monarchic powers within Saudi to affect the politics and the religion of the region and to put up a counterforce to the struggles that are going on there. They're using this by hiring henchmen and by feeding with substantial oil revenues forces of dissension within the region. I quite well agree with that. So there are allies within Turkey that can be bought with oil revenues. There is an internecine warfare going on and an interreligious warfare going on there that holds the prospects of very, very dire consequences for the world, not just the region. So, and a lot of this is fueled, in fact, by Saudi money. But the Saudis are not the only players there. There is very few on either side or on multiple sides that are actually reaching for peace and reaching to have a pacific solution to this problem. What they're looking for is domination. And that, yes.
Name the players. Who do you think are the major players in this very ill game? Who do you think the players are?
Well, the players are actually it's an internecine conflict within Islam, fighting for the heart and soul of a religion.
So you think that this is a war dealing with Islam?
I think largely it is, but there are other political, certainly subsets of this that are playing themselves out as well.
Okay, turning to London.
Remarks that were made regarding the British and the... Go ahead. I'm sorry.
London, your take. Does this have anything to do with Islam in your perspective?
No, thanks to the colleagues who attempt at corrective in our dialogue that we're having here. But, you know, again, this narrative that it's some kind of contestation within conflicting kind of standard bearers of Islam, again, I think is perpetuating something which does not respect Islam as a faith and those many millions of Muslims who do not have anything to do with this dirty little squabble that ISIS is involved in. Now, I understand it's difficult. I understand it's difficult to really kind of discern the Islamophobic nature of that type of narrative when you have ISIS and its supporters, which are in mass numbers, that has to be said, who are saying that we are the banner holders of Islam, etc. We are God's chosen people who will deliver, justice against tyranny on the planet, and everyone outside of our perspective is dehumanized and can be murdered, frankly, in depraved ways. Which, interesting enough, is just the asymmetric mirror image conceptually of Zionism and of white supremacy born out of colonialism and neo-colonialism. The thing is, our colleague in Washington should be reminded, and I don't think he needs to be reminded, because again, I think it's to do with the way his political bias sits on the matter, is that ISIS would be nowhere, that the Gulf monarchies' support and lifting of ISIS would have gone nowhere if it wasn't for their senior partnership with the regimes in London and Washington and also Paris. How can it be that what's come to light is that Mohammed Emwazi, infamously known as so-called Jihadi John, was monitored very closely by the British intelligence services, and then he ends up going to Syria and becoming one of the most infamous and notorious depraved nutters of the death squads there. There's no doubt, and I'm not into wacky conspiracies. I counter wacky conspiracies about the Illuminati and the Freemasons and Jews or Israel rule the world. I don't think any of that's true. I think the people who are running the world are the leading NATO powers, and they're facilitating the ISIS death squads. There's no way we can have 300 to 500 young people going to join ISIS in Syria via Turkey from Britain without the British intelligence services knowing their movements and really de facto facilitating that. Now, those who are supporting ISIS, either openly or in a deceitful manner, can never point to the fact that the British intelligence services are overseeing this. Yes, actually, we've had Muazzam Beg, who's a well-known ex-Guantanamo and Bagram detainee, and he went through a horrific experience there, but that does not justify teaming up with MI5, which he did, and then him giving him a green light to train armed gangs in Aleppo in Syria illegally. So ISIS is just the vanguard ground troops in a covert operation by the leading NATO powers in the Muslim world.
Stay with me, Mr. Chandan. And Mr. Peterson, we're going to cross over to our Facebook comments and see what some of our viewers are saying about the subject.
They are willing to kill in order to gain oil and power. These people deserve harsher punishment than other terrorists. Of course, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Western countries are supporting terrorists. Iran is funding ISIL, terrorists helping terrorists. Shame on America for funding ISIL. Let the truth be known. It's commonly believed that Saudi Arabia, USA, Israel, and Turkey are financing ISIL terrorists. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Israel, Great Britain, USA, and France are the founders of terrorism in the Middle East. Long live Erdogan. Press TV is anti-Turkey. Iran is fighting against ISIL, not supporting them. Saudi Arabia and the USA all know this. Reveal the names of the countries who buy oil from ISIL. Definitely there are groups from Iran to Turkey who are purchasing oil from them because it's cheaper. Terrorism doesn't represent Islam and Muslims, as killing innocent people is strictly prohibited in Islam.
Well, a wide range of views, Mr. Peterson, when we listen to some of our Facebook comments talking about, again, most people are pointing the finger at higher powers that are actually also supporting this situation, from the United States, that connection to Saudi Arabia and Israel. I want your perspective on the role, if any, do you think, that the United States plays in ISIL?
Virtually none. And I would say that what we're now, none in an affirmative, planned, scheming way. Now, the role that is being played is not one of affirmative facilitation or design. The role is rather one of cowardice. It's a sheep-like role in tolerating bad behavior. In the toleration of bad behavior, one rewards bad behavior. And the somehow looking at the United States intelligence services, particularly today under this administration, and the British services under that administration, to think that somehow they are the scheming global monoliths of power is almost laughable. What they are people who have lost character and lost even a definition of themselves and a counter belief with which to counter this.
Can we look at the Can we look at the situation, for example?
I see.
When we look at the situation that took place in Syria, and we saw that the United States and its allies talking about supporting the more moderate elements, and these more moderate elements have joined forces with ISIL, and still again today, one more time, the United States again is saying now that they are training and supporting the more moderate elements, again this time in Turkey and in Jordan, but still funding that. So is there any connection?
Well, what they're doing is reaching not for a rock on which to hold, but reaching for a feather, reaching for a straw, reaching for some explanation of their own ineptitude and lack of action and lack of good behavior, lack of leadership. I don't see this as a design on the part of the West. I see it as a moral failure, a failure to act, not a manipulation at all.
All right.
Unfortunately.
All right. Let me turn back to London. Your take on that question, Mr. Sukant Chandan.
Yes, just late last year, Joe Biden visited Turkey and decided to point fingers at everyone. And as they say, you point one finger at anyone else, four fingers are pointed back at yourself. Joe Biden, because the West was starting to get very embarrassed, because since the Arab sting, it openly teamed up with ISIS and Nusra and Al-Qaeda type of death squad forces openly and overtly in the destruction of Libya and then rolling into Syria. So they had to give some explanation of why on earth they've openly teamed up with them. So they decided to point the fingers at their junior partners in the region. I mean, Joe Biden is correct that Turkey and the Gulf monarchies is supporting these death squads, but also they're only doing it through also the partnership of their senior partners of Joe Biden and his administration. Hillary Clinton, when she was getting heat of having teamed up with the death squads in Libya, who then lynched their senior colleague in Christopher Stevens a couple of years ago now, also said at a formal hearing that she was very candid. She says, we, i.e. the United States, created Al-Qaeda in the crucible of civil war and death squad depravity, which was Afghanistan in the 80s. And they've turned Syria and Libya into a new version of Afghanistan of the 80s to promote their strategic interests through divide and ruin and neo-colonial terrorism. I put this to the guest in Washington, and I'm sure he's aware of the book or the research in it by Mark Curtis about Britain's secret affairs with so-called radical Islam. That's his terminology I don't agree with, but that's the name of the book, in which he really very convincingly shows the research evidence that in this so-called Western war on terror, why is it that the West's primary allies in the war on terror are the very institutions that are propping up in the non-Western world these Al-Qaeda and ISIS and etc. other death squad forces, i.e. the Turkish state, the Gulf monarchies, the Pakistani ISI and the Zionist state. The United Nations has made a formal complaint. Why is the Zionist state collaborating with the Nusra death squads on the Jalan, and obviously Turkey collaborating on the Syrian
Hopefully
border with
another
themselves?
time we can have both of you back and discuss more about this subject, but I appreciate both of you being with us out of London. Mr. Sukant Chandan, filmmaker and political commentator, and out of Washington, D.C., Congressional Defense Policy Advisor, Mr. Frederick Peterson. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us right here on another debate. I'm Marzieh Hashemi, signing out for myself and all my colleagues right here in Tehran. Thanks so much for being with us, and goodbye.